Uh, and I was anxious because um, I feel like I don't pray like I hear everybody else pray in this congregation. My go-to prayer is a little bit different. I may have shared it with you once before. So I thought I'm going to lead you guys with me or take you with me in my two go-to prayers. And I'm going to explain um, how I feel about each one, or each piece of it, I should say. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt, which to me is a way of starting every day by saying, God, what do you need from me today? What of my gifts do I need to share with the world today? Relieve me of the bondage of self. I remind myself of that daily. I imagine that daily. Being wrapped up in my own BS that I cannot serve anyone, much less myself. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do thy will. Because unless I can unwrap myself, I can't do anything. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help, which means we all have difficulties and they are valid no matter what we're going through. We're asking God to take them away because eventually this too shall pass. And when it does, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. And this prayer keeps me in check on a daily basis. It reminds me, like today, I had tremendous anxiety about praying. Why is the pastor asking me to lead prayer? But get over yourself, Julia. Get over yourself and share what I could share honestly with you guys. That's my gift. So that's what I did today. All right. And with that, I'll pass that. Oh, can I get an amen? How about that? All right. Hold on.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. I don't have the announcements on my. I don't. Oh, huh? Oh, I'm doing the reading. Never mind. Thank goodness, I'm not doing announcements. We're going to do the reading now. Feel free to join in at home and here as well. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me.
Let there be peace on earth, the peace that was meant to be.
With God, our Creator, siblings all are we. Let me walk with my sibling in perfect harmony.
Let peace begin with me. Let this be the moment now.
With every step I take, let this be my solemn vow.
To take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally.
Let
Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me.
with me.
Hallelujah.
Now, who am I passing it off to? I'm sorry. Oh, there it is there.
All right. So, uh, happy Sunday. Happy last month of the year almost. Wow, right? Getting there. So today we're going to hear from Linda Quiquivix. And yeah, so we just passed right by her name. Okay. We're going to hear from her over Zoom, I understand. And then also Wednesday night, we're welcoming everybody. Caroline will be moderating a conversation on how nostalgia may have shaped our lives and how we deal with that, how we acknowledge and face it, and perhaps release ourselves from it. And it's just good to be together. Everybody's invited. Next Sunday, we will return to the series Queerness in the Bible. Our next in person, the next time we will be here together will be December 3rd, so less than a month from now. It will be our first annual toy drive. If you have any new or gently used toys, bring them to this location, 1915 Japala Street. And we will be sharing communion. And if you're on Zoom, use whatever you have. You will certainly provide more variety than we will here today. Now we pass the plate. We've had an amazing year. 2023 has been such a blessing to all of us. And as we prepare to budget ourselves for 2024, I ask you, just listen to your heart. Your heart is not going to lead you astray. So just be generous in the way that you have been, or whatever way. Today's quote comes from Carlton Pearson, um, someone that Diane and I have known. He doesn't know us, but we've known him because we knew him in youth events uh, when we were kids, and he was a teenager, and he was a preacher even back then for our youth events. And now he is in hospice. Um, Anytime that knowledge and a version of the truth are considered to be absolute, fundamentalism is the result. Whether the arena is Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or any other religious faith, as well as atheism, conservative or liberal political views, even evolution or intelligent design, anytime our minds are closed and there's no room for dissent, we are on a slippery slope towards stagnation. Carlton Pearson. All right, everybody, go and give somebody a high five. If they want you to, you can breathe on them, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's a lot of stuff going around. And if you're on Zoom, shout out to whoever you want to. Our guest speaker is on Zoom, so spotlight her. Linda Q, the spotlight. I don't know what. Well, whichever one is on Zoom, spotlight her. You can go ahead and do it now. All right, everybody. So, um, how about a big thank you for Lance on the drums, Lance Charles, everybody, and for Matthew Moore on guitar. Yeah. Everybody doing okay? All right. Well, we hopefully will be more okay before we leave here. Um, Dr. Linda is a critical geographer focusing on environmental justice, knowledge production, and Black and Indigenous land struggles in the Americas and Middle East. She looks at map making and seed saving as lenses onto these questions. She received a doctorate in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2012 and served as an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Brown University from 2012 to 2014. She serves as program director and principal investigator at Living Books Institute for Community Ecology. Her writings have been translated into Arabic, Spanish, French, and Italian. She regularly translates indigenous political theory from Latin American Spanish into English. I first encountered Linda when Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz was here in town at the Unitarian Society hosting an event for her, a book signing event, and people came from various locations. And Linda is in Oxnard, I think, at least it's Ventura County. And I was impressed with the way that she moved around among young people. And at the time, she was leading kind of her own personal school at a park back in the days when I used to travel to Oxnard all the time. But it was never at the time when I was going to be there. So I never went. I wanted to go to one of those, but I never got there. But I know that you all gathered in the park, you and teenagers of all sorts, and she's heavily invested in the spirit of life, and that's why she's here among us today. Take it away, Linda. Let's test your volume. Go ahead and say something.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Is that good, everybody? Okay, let's
Great.
do this.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It really is an honor to be in community with folks who are thinking and feeling at the most deepest, profound levels in terms of these questions of what is life for and how do we relate to each other? How do we share this world? And you know, the opening prayers that we heard very much, you know, talk about how do we walk side by side with our siblings in harmony, and that's really the topic that interests me. I want to put in the chat because I use a lot of maps, but I won't be using maps today. We'll just be in conversation. In the chat, I'm putting a link to a recent 2-hour teach-in using maps about this question, how do we share the world together? How do we share the world together while respecting our differences? That has been the great question that my work has tried to engage with. My work is connected to a lot of movements all around the world who are seeking justice, who are seeking respect for their differences. I am a geographer raised by Palestinians, raised by Zapatistas in Chiapas, also raised by the Black radical tradition through the Panthers and through enslaved runaways on this continent, on these lands, who ran away from the plantations to try to create a whole different way of being. And were joined with Native Americans and were joined with outcasts from Europe, who also were looking for something new. A lot of my work looks at how over the last 500 years, we on these lands, and not just us on these lands, Native peoples, but peoples all over the globe, including within Europe, even before 500 years, have been forced to be one way. When I went to Palestine about 15 years ago for the first time, and I ended up staying to live there, I was trying to figure out what are the assumptions that we have when we talk about Palestine? What are the assumptions that we have when we talk about Israel, when we talk about Jewish liberation? Because the question of Jewish liberation is a question that has not yet been resolved. The state of Israel is a project that markets itself that way, that is the only place that Jews can live to feel safe. And we've seen that that's not true. And we also see the liberatory spirit of our Jewish relatives who understand that their faith is based on social justice principles, on witnessing and being there with others who are being oppressed, in addition, of course, with millennia, centuries of oppression against them for just being who they are. In Europe, for centuries before 1492, Jews could not be who they are. And not just Jews, but also other faith traditions in Europe called pagan traditions. Here in the Americas, in Abya what becomes the Americas, we were and have been discriminated against for not sharing the same faith, for not identifying as Christian or Catholic or part of the Abrahamic traditions. And what we saw here after October 12, 1492, the enslavement, the genocide, the conversions, the forced conversions, the burning of our sacred texts, the destruction of our civilizations, what we witnessed, I found out after doing this research with Palestine and Palestine's borders and Palestine's maps. What I learned without expecting to was that we're all tied by 1492, not just October 12, 1492. There was also January 2nd, 1492, which we don't learn enough about. On January 2nd, 1492, the Iberian Peninsula, which would become Spain, finished ethnically cleansing the Muslim civilization that had been there for hundreds of years with the surrender of Granada. January 2nd, 1492 was the surrender of the last Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula at the hands of Queen Isabella of Castile. Christopher Columbus was in Granada as well, waiting for Granada to fall. It was understood as a victory for Catholicism, for Christendom, for European Christendom, at a moment when Constantinople had just fallen just a few decades before in 1453 at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. So there was this threat in Europe before they reached us, before the Europeans reached us on these lands. They were understanding themselves to be fighting an apocalyptic battle for the making of the earth, for defining the making of the earth. They did not allow anyone to be different on the Iberian Peninsula under that rule. They forced, after that, Jews to convert to Catholicism almost immediately. I was in Granada summer 2021. I was in Spain waiting for the Zapatistas to march on Madrid on August 13th, the 500-year anniversary of the fall of Tenochtitlan. And that happened on August 13, 1521. So they came on August 13, 2021 to let the world know we have not been conquered. In the days before that, I got to Spain early. I went to Granada and I saw there what I saw also in Madrid a few days later, that the monuments for 1492 in Spain have not just the date, October 12th, they have the date, January 2nd. This is where modern European historiography is marked. If it's not 1453, with the fall of Constantinople, it is certainly 1492. And Spain's self-narrative is that January 2nd was the beginning of modern history for Spain. Christopher Columbus had been in Granada, waiting for Granada to surrender so that he could get Isabella's attention. And the way that he and Isabella had discussions about sailing west had very much to do with the apocalyptic Catholic fervor of wanting Jerusalem next. There's a book called Columbus and Jerusalem that talks about his obsession with Jerusalem. It's in his diaries. The reason for sailing west was precisely to take Jerusalem next. And of course, the speed bump that are these lands of Yala prevented that for a few centuries, but it allowed Europeans, Western Europeans, the empires to become very wealthy and very strong. That it would be in the 19th century. So from the 15th century, not until the 19th century, when there would be a quote unquote peaceful crusade. This is when the Ottoman Empire was falling and the European empires had already risen, were very strong, and now we're encroaching into Palestine, hoping to take Jerusalem next. And that's where we're beginning with Napoleon in 1799, who was trying to go to war with Britain by turning his warships over to Egypt and Palestine to try to cut the canal that would become Suez in order to get to India, to take the quote unquote crown jewel from the British Empire. The idea had been to have Jews from Europe move to Palestine in order to do a couple of things that are still true today. And one of them is to have a European imperial presence in the region, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Middle East, vis-a-vis Europe. European orientation calls it the Middle East, the middle of the East, according to Europe. And also there was an apocalyptic vision still held and is still held today, that of a very literal translation of the Bible, that fundamentalist understanding that was just spoken about in the room a few moments before, that understood the Bible in a very specific way. Evangelicals from the United States and England went to Palestine in the early 1800s, throughout the 1800s, to force their version of Christianity as true by mapping it out scientifically. And that was an effort that took place together with the evangelical Christians, together with the engineers of the British war machine, under the cover of science and religion. Those maps that were created of the so-called Holy Land, which I remember when I was young and I would see the maps at the back of the Bible, I would be like, wow, they preserved these maps for 2,000 years of the Holy Land. Those maps are very new. Those maps are 19th century maps forward. And what we saw then is that those maps, the British military was able to use to then conquer Palestine and colonize it, along with the British, the French, and the Russians, who were salivating over the territories that the Ottoman Empire was ruling and wondering who would take those, which imperial powers in Europe would take those lands, because they were all competing for those lands, and how would that shift the relationship of power within Europe. And so we see Christian Zionism precede even Jewish Zionism. Now, of course, there are many Zionisms for our Jewish relatives. The idea of Jerusalem has been very important to their lives in exile. And not in exile, of course, there was Jews living in Palestine who were Arabs, spoke Arabic, used the word Allah, just like Christian Arabs who also use the word Allah to talk about God. But when political Zionism comes around, the idea of a nation state, of a modern nation state, which is a brand new idea from Europe as a way to control territory as a container. And there's a lot more to say about that in the video, if you'd like to see it, where I use maps to talk about the genesis of modern borders as contracts between Europeans over which territories they're going to control. And we see that right away after 1492 with the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Portuguese are granted by the Pope everything east of the line to invade, and the Castilians and Aragonese, who become Spain, are granted everything west of the line to invade. And then the cutting up of Abiyala into viceroyalties that then later become all of these nation states that we know today, including Mexico, not just the settler colonies of Canada and the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, all down. Those are all settler colonies. They're all European facing, and they have tried in different ways to achieve the extermination of the Native American. In the United States, it was largely through blood, dead blood. In Mexico and Guatemala, for example, it is through consciousness. It is by trying to get us to believe that we're Native, by getting us to believe that we're something called mestizo or Ladino, by getting us to believe that we are Mexican or Guatemalan. We are Native American. We have been forbidden, many of us, ridiculed, enforced that we not speak our native languages. In Mexico, for example, according to the Mexican state, you are native if you still speak your native language. And what the Mexican state has done over the last 100 years is try to disappear all of those languages by making it making it so that children in school do not speak their language. So my ancestral family are Maya Mam. The Mam territory was cut by that border of Mexico, Guatemala. And on the Mexican side, the Mam communities, almost none of them speak Mam anymore. It was discouraged in school. In Guatemala, many of us still speak Mam. What we see in the cutting up of the world is an attempt to homogenize all of the people in it in order to prevent any resistance, that the world could be a different way. And of course, we see nation states serving as plantations. We're going to talk about Africa. We need to talk about Africa. How is it that we know about Hitler, but we don't know about King Leopold? After the cutting up of the Americas into viceroyalties and then later into nation states, Europe does that to itself too. Europe tries to cut itself up. Scholars call it a colonial reflection. And so there we see also the rise of nation states. And these nation states are very racist. They're very anti-Semitic. They do not tolerate any difference. And so we see in the 19th century, especially, a massive increase of discrimination against anyone who's different. And of course, our relatives, the Jewish people, are part of that, of the oppressed groups, and not just the only, but that of course then culminates into the Nazi Holocaust. Within Europe, Germany is one of the last to quote unquote unite. That's what they mean by creating a nation state called Germany. Italy also, this was in the 1870s. And Germany has an inferiority complex to Britain, to France, to the other empires. It starts growing its armies and it wants colonies. And so the Berlin Conference is called by Germany to put up on the wall a map of Africa and see how it's going to be all divided among the European powers and which ones Germany is going to be allowed to take, right? And so there you see the scramble for Africa that took decades. And there's a single person who gets an entire territory called the Congo so-called Free State, and that is King Leopold of Belgium. And he rules it as his private property. And this is with the consent of all the other European powers who cut up Africa. And it serves as a rubber plantation for him. And he forces Native African people to work in his plantation to collect rubber. This is a moment where automobiles and bicycles are calling for more and more rubber for tires. And he destroys villages if people do not want to work. He tortures people if they do not work enough, and cuts off their hands as punishment and demands that the officers all be shown the hands that have been cut just to make sure they can count how many people received the obedience, the discipline that was necessary for transgressing King Leopold's commands. Africa has been cut up. Africa has been cut up by the Europeans, just like the Americas have been cut up by the Europeans. Europe has been cut up by the Europeans. Now we need to make a distinction that's actually very helpful because not all Europeans are the same. There's always been a battle within Europe against the above by the below. There's been an above and below framing of the universe, of the cosmos, that you're either above or you're below. That difference has to be ranked into superior and inferior. That you're either the master or you're going to be the slave. And so then you better be the master and make somebody else your slave. This is the cosmovision that Europeans brought to these lands in 1492 and had already been battling against within their lands in 1492, the below. There's a Europe from above and a Europe from below. Just like there is a United States from above and a United States from below. Just like there's black people above, black people below, brown people above, brown people below. White people above, they call their below white trash. This is an epithet, a racial epithet to make it so that we all know what white is supposed to be and what white is not supposed to be. And the white people from above like to point to the white people below as a racist. And then that deflects us from seeing the entire thing as racist. The entire system is racist. It means dehumanizing. To place humans above other humans is racist. To create this idea of what a human is, the rational man of Europe, and then to call the rest of us non-human, to call us terrorists, for example, right? That's racism. It's phenotype, the way we look, is secondary to this logic. This logic exists and it's going to shuffle our identities around. And the identities that have been shuffled in this system over the last 500 years into it is that people who are phenotypically lighter skin are above and phenotypically darker skin are below. When we talk about the cutting up of the world into plantations and think about the Congo went from being a rubber plantation to being a coltan plantation, to being a diamond plantation that serves nothing of the peoples who are from those lands. And it just serves those above. Notice, this is a God trick. This is the above acting as if they are God. The above looking down at the world and cutting it up as if they could own it, as if it could be cut up into objects of control. We need to talk about imposter gods. We need to talk about God. That's why it's so important that we're here, that congregations exist to talk about God. We don't talk about God enough. Many of us in the social justice world have been traumatized by church, by religion, and we overcorrect too much. We don't want to talk about God. We need to talk about God, God, the force of creation and destruction. That's why I want to talk about God. The force of creation and the force of destruction. And I also want to bring in the room Baruch Spinoza, who is one of the great philosophers, as far as I'm concerned, as far as many are concerned, of Europe. Baruch Spinoza was a Jew whose family had been from Spain and kicked out because they did not convert, and they ended up in Amsterdam. So century, he's writing about God. He makes the case for a true monotheistic God. And he writes that God does not care about us specifically as people, which is, of course, very controversial. But what he says is that God is a force, and we are all extensions of that force. God is everywhere, which is very similar to how a lot of Native peoples understand God, that God is everywhere. And that is interpreted sometimes as paganism. Baruch Spinoza was making the case for a true monotheistic God. And it is that great force of creation and destruction. Sadly, he was excommunicated by his temple because his temple believed that God is a man or resembles a man and does care about what we do, which is, of course, very helpful in terms of a society knowing that there is someone who cares about you and is looking out for you. We call that the ancestors in the Maya world. We understand it as a collective. The ancestors as a collective, they're the ones who have left inheritances in the world that we are taking up. I love so much the opening prayer that I think the first lines, and that was Julia, the first lines where, waking up in the morning and asking God, what gifts do you need me to offer the world? I ask that of my ancestors every day. Which ones of my gifts do you need in the struggle for life? Because we are in a struggle for the defense of life on this planet. I think about God, the God of Judaism and the God of Christianity, because I've thought for a long time, and I went to Palestine convinced I was not going to talk about God, convinced this was not about religion, convinced this was just political, secular, because that's how I had been raised by the movements here. And it turns out it's both, and that there isn't an easy distinction between the political and the religious in terms of God. Politics is about power. God is about power. When I think about the difference between Judaism and Christianity's version of God, with Judaism, God is interesting in that God is both the creator and the destroyer. God is both the force of good and evil. Christianity, which is, of course, part of Judaism, a branch of Judaism, did something very interesting in its battle against empire. And we know Christianity is a revolutionary movement from its inception against empire. Christianity splits God. Christianity understands God to be good and empire to be evil. And that is very helpful for a revolution to understand the enemy. Where is your enemy? And who are you fighting with and who are you fighting against? And I think about how Constantine, when the Roman Empire co-opted Christianity in the 4th century, and that co-optation has been so destructive. And Christians of conscience, Christians from the revolutionary tradition have been battling that co-optation for a long time. That co-optation made it so that anything against the empire is the devil. Jews, women, pagans, who they call witches. The co-optation of Christianity by the empire, and now this has become empire spirituality.
Linda.
Yes.
So this is very rich, and we're at a place where we want to make sure that we're going to have time to let people ask any questions they might want to ask. But maybe you have something, like a summation for us before we go to that.
Yeah, taking it then, this is a summation. I was reading Jewish liberation theology the other day. There is a Jewish liberation theologian named Mark Ellis, and he has been invited to speak about Palestine liberation. And there hasn't really been a way to understand what he's trying to do. And I think that what his work is key, and that congregations have work to do. All of us have work to do. And what he says is that after the Holocaust, there was a crisis in God among Judaism. And that crisis of how could God allow this has opened up a vacuum for Israel, for Zionism to step in and say, Israel will never allow this. He doesn't use this phrase, impostor God, but I use that phrase, impostor God. There is a battle for Judaism, just like there has been a battle for Christianity and a battle for all of our faith traditions against co-optation. He calls Israel Zionism, Constantinian Judaism. This is a co-optation of Judaism. And there has been, as there's always been in all of our movements, those who continue to resist. Mark Ellis is one who continues to resist. And he calls himself part of a failed generation who couldn't resist it. But an inheritance that he has left on is this question of how can all of our faith traditions share the world together? That's really the big question to sum it up. How, instead of imposing one world on all of us that has been going on since 1492, whether it is a Christianity or an Islam or a Judaism or any type of world, instead of a one world, how can we share the world together with all of our differences? And as the Zapatistas say, I just want to leave you with this phrase. How do we create a world where many worlds fit?
Say that again.
A world where many worlds fit.
A world where many worlds fit. Well, can we say thank you to Linda, everybody? Yeah. I asked Robina to respond. Robina, are you there?
I am.
Okay. I asked Robina, who I'm global studies professor at Cal State Monterey, and someone who thinks about the things that you think about a lot, Linda, to just be the first person to open the conversation. So, Robina.
Yes. So I want to begin by thanking you, Linda, for being here. This was, as Pastor said, really rich. And I am so glad that he invited me to do this. I'm always hesitant. I question when someone asks me to do something, and then I go into a series of why. But let me begin with saying that I was somewhat familiar with your work, but I took the trouble to become much more familiar. And everything I read, I just loved it. I want to begin by saying the question that you posed, that you began with, and then where you ended with, is such a key question today. More and more people have been questioning this construction of a one world. And I want to go through what you put forward in terms of why each of the points that you brought up are so important to understanding where we are, whether it is with the Zapatistas in Chiapas, where other decolonial struggles are going on, and especially with Palestine as well today. So I love the way that you begin the history of global designs, and then you go on to the varying apocalyptic visions and how cartographies, political cartographies, play a part in that as well. Most of them, we know they are political because they're personal, because they are about power as well. I also like the progression towards modernity and the creation of a nation state, which is very, very recent. We tend to think that this has always been and will always be, when we know that boundaries are being redrawn every single day. And I love that you paused to consider how people have been, and you yourself have reclaimed indigeneity, and you connected it with this division of not just the Americas, but particularly Africa, that is left out of the story, where a different world, and especially the kind of cruelty and violence that was enacted by King Leopold in Africa. You mentioned that. So you didn't leave that out of your narrative. And then to give us an understanding of how this formula, how these visions work, how these cosmovisions work, you laid out how the hierarchical system works and how the ranking system works. So what is the governing code here in terms of how all of this cruelty and violence and the construction of a one world, supposedly a global world where we all belong, but we really do not belong at all. You laid that out, and then you introduced the notion of imposter gods. So that was really wonderful. You reference all of these people that help us understand how these cosmovisions work today. And then to end all of this, you came to the key question, which I didn't quite get when I started reading your work, was you said this is a matter of religion. And when someone says religion, that's a practice. So what I really discovered in reading from you is our existence, our life. How do we, the spirit of life is what it is that you were referring to, which is this is about the spirit of life, not so much about Judaism or Christianity or Islam per se. And so what is actually going on in the construction of these worlds, these global designs, these visions, these cosmovisions is about life. And it is the violence that is enacted that is about taking this life or destroying this life. So all of this I just really loved. It resonates with me quite a bit. But one question that I did have for you is, in looking at this history, you are primarily looking at human history. And if we're looking at the world as a whole, and if we're really looking from the spirit of life, and you referenced over and over again the reclaiming of your indigenous roots and how God is everywhere, which is what we call our ancestors. Our ancestors are not just humans, they are plants and animal life. So the greater ecology, that's what I found missing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Robina.
Yeah, thank you, Robina.
Yes. Yeah. The defense for life. This is a second book that I'm writing. The first one is this Palestine 1492, and it's been the Zapatistas who have kind of led the way in the greater ecology with the very Maya philosophy, of course, with the where plants are our ancestors, and of course we are all animals. You know, when they call us human animals, all of us are animals, and trying to get away from that hierarchy of the human and the non-human. And yeah, a lot of our my discourse, a lot of our movement discourse has changed or shifted away from humanity, the struggle for humanity, into the struggle for life, which is meant to encompass all of it. Yeah. And you know, and there is still a human story to be told, but with a compassionate kind of humanity, not the humanity capital H that's been defined by the European empires of who counts as human. So thank you for that.
Well, so I think probably you distilled this at the end in a way that I can really get my fingers around when you brought up the imposter God being true for at least the Abrahamic religions and probably other practices as well. And I think of I was listening to an interview by of Ta-Nehisi Coates, the African American author, and he was visiting, like yourself, he was visiting Palestine, and he had a Palestinian um, uh, guide taking him and his colleagues through various checkpoints, and he got to a particular checkpoint, and the Palestinian guide says, "Well, you have to go by yourself from here. I'm not allowed to go any further." So they kept going, and they got to a checkpoint, and Ta-Nehisi Coates says there was a there was this young Israeli officer with a long gun who asked him, "What religion are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm not religious." And the guy thought he was toying with him, that he was not being serious. He said, "No." And he says, "Okay, then what religion were your parents?" And he said, "Well, they weren't very religious either." And so, it goes on for a while, and he says, "Well, what religion were your grandparents?" And he said, "Well, my grandmother was a Christian." And he said, "Okay, you can pass." So, I mean, that's pretty telling. Since I was out of town for a while, and so October 7th, uh, you know, Gaza and all of that started happening while I was away, and I got home a week ago, and I started contacting some of my friends who I know who are Jewish. And interestingly, and you might have a thought on this, but I had a conversation with a Jewish friend who is practicing. She's religious. And I asked her how she was doing, and because I know that just being Jewish, you can get it from both sides, right? She's uh, from the Gentiles and from Jews because of the imposter God thing. How are you doing? Do you feel safe? This was just yesterday afternoon, and she articulated that she didn't use the word fearful, but she was having to be more alert around her Jewish community than among Gentiles when it came to persecution. And we both knew, we didn't use the term imposter God, but we know that in the religious community we've seen it very dominantly in the Christian world in the United States, especially over the past few years, rising to power. But this is happening in the Jewish world. How do we live, Linda? How do we respond, whether we are Jews or Gentiles or Muslims or maybe non-Abrahamics? How do we live and have our place in the world?
I think that we need to recognize more the real fear that our Jewish relatives experience in this world. And that's why I talk about Palestine 1492. I talk about empire, not just Zionism. Zionism is a response to trying to survive within empire, and as long as it's a closed system where in order to survive, we have to ask our oppressors if it's okay for us to survive, which of course comes with the price of the ticket, as James Baldwin put it, right? You need to then be useful to the empire and oppress others. And as long as that's our closed system, as long as we don't have models and alternatives all over the world that show that we can live side by side, together side by side, with our difference instead of trying to assimilate into the empire in order to survive, then it's going to be really hard for all of us and Jews in this particular case to feel that there could be an alternative to Israel, even though within their own history, within a lot of history, there have been alternatives. So recognizing that empire is the greater problem, and doing all we can to highlight models, highlight alternatives of people living differently, of societies living differently with with the world, with each other, with difference. I think that that's our big challenge, is to do that, and to do that where we are. It's not just about Palestine, Israel. We're here living on a settler colony called the United States. So how could we do that work right now of decolonizing our relationships without simply just asking, our Jewish relatives to do it about Israel? It's not just Israel, it's empire and
So,
Israel at the same time.
so are you prescribing that are you saying that we can come into this community, this sense of solidarity if we stop making ourselves useful to empire?
We need to stop making ourselves useful to empire. We're so dependent on it too, especially in the United States. We can have our critiques of capitalism, but how many of us know how to live without capitalism?
Wow. Rosie? No, they can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. Hi, Linda. This is Rosie, and wow, te aventaste, hermana. And I say Nikin Tlaka. Um, I have been raising the question of anti-Semitism because it is a created word for a specific respond. And so, what do you think about that?
Thank you, Rosie.
Yeah, that word anti-Semitism is interesting in this particular context where Arabs are supposed to be, the anti-Semites, except Arabs are Semites. Like, this is a constructed word from Europe to point to how Jews are not European. So they're more like, their kin in the Middle East. And so then to flip this against Palestinians or anyone in support of Palestinian resistance is actually why, another example why we need to stop being useful to empire, that our oppressed kin, our Jewish relatives, after the Holocaust, had different responses to struggle. And the only one we know about is Zionism, is Israel. That has been very useful for empire to have the oppressed, the below, what Fanon calls the wretched of the earth, now the above, while still maintaining up front their wretched status, their oppressed status. We saw at the United Nations Israeli officials wearing the yellow Star of David that the Nazis forced Jews to wear in Europe. And so what we have here is empire's trick to take some of us from below, include it above, and then whenever we critique empire, now it can deflect critique by calling us anti-Semitic, by calling us racist, by co-opting our language of resistance.
Yes, I think Lance was going to say something.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lance Charles, and I come to you completely off the street. I literally here to play drums, but I've been working the last 40 years to create a response to your viewpoint, which is really interesting because what I like to do is take a look at 1491 when in the Mississippi Valley forever there had been enough food, everyone had a place to sleep. Queen Mississippi would not go to sleep unless everyone had a place. And this is how we had come here in Santa Barbara. Okay. Who knows the queen of the Chumash people that met Cabrillo on his death with love and compassion?
Linda? What's next? Linda?
I love that. It brought me back to the spirit of Robina's thoughts. I think that's key. 1491, right? So many examples of a world where many worlds fit already. And not just us, all over Africa, all over Asia, and some still in Europe trying to keep alive. But yeah, we need the medicine that is these examples of that human spirit sharing the world. And there is where we get to the deep ecological question before the split of the human and the non-human, right? How we observe, how we learn through plants, for example. I did a lot of education on farms and gardens, and I didn't call it. We're talking about God, but it's it was a similar spark to that spirit. So thank you for bringing in 1491. That is medicine. Also, so much of it still exists there where it can. There's a book called Mexico Profundo. I'll put it in the chat. It's translated from the Spanish, but it maintains the Spanish title. And it talks about how there is still a lot of native practice in Mexico, even if we're just called Mexicans now. There is a Mexico that looks at Europe, and then the deep Mexico, the Mexico Profundo, that is that Native America. So there's still these other worlds, right? 1491 had many worlds where many worlds fit, a world where many worlds fit. And now those are being extinguished, but they're still alive, and there's new ones in creation and construction and in weaving. So our task is to find those and to be part of the creation of those if we really do want to be in this battle for sharing the world together, rather than the one that we're seeing right now, which is causing the destruction of even planet Earth, something that our ancestors collectively had never had to deal with. This is our new challenge of our time. How do we share the world together with difference in the face of climate collapse, in the face of extinction?
So we're going to go ahead and finish now. I think no one would disagree. We could probably have Linda just like do a series, a course that we could sign up for. Yeah. So may you find continual peace. May your pathway be peace, and may your destination be peace. And we will connect. We are connected. We are part of your community. You are part of ours. We are the people who are trying to not be useful to empire. Some perhaps more efficiently than more than others. But that's our global consciousness. That's our global community. There's people who just don't want to concede. And so we will not concede. And that doesn't mean it's always going to be easy, right? Oh my goodness. It's not going to always be easy, but and sometimes we're going to be threatened, like my Jewish friend that I just mentioned. Maybe even by our own people, if you want to call them that. That's where we have to find who are really our own people, who may look different from us and have a different language and maybe a different heritage, but ultimately, as Robina was saying, we ultimately have the same plant and animal heritage. So ancestors, we need you. We need your wisdom. We need indigenous wisdom. Um, there's in French Guyana, kind of close to Sally's neighborhood, there is a plant that has been used for centuries to rub the oil on, and it resists termites, and it also stops malaria infections. But a Norwegian pharmaceutical company has basically gone in and harvested those things and put them in little white tablets and profit. And the people who live there do not get any of that profit. We need the wisdom, but we need to not exploit the wisdom. We need the indigenous wisdom. Well, I said we're going to stop, and we're going to stop. Kenichi, would you come and conclude our time today? Boy, I tell you, it's just good to be in communion with you, Linda. And we have such an odd congregation because we could not exist without people who either travel here, like Kenichi and Sayuri came from Pasadena, and the Rabinas up in Monterey, and and Lompoc. I mean, and Ventura. It's a mystery to me. Come on, Kenichi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Linda. Yeah, hopefully we will have you in person next time. So thank you. Well, in the spirit of the Lord's table as we approach, and those of us who are online, whatever you have available, I'd like to return to the question, how are we with different worlds, different communities, with all of our differences, are able to live together in peace and harmony? And I couldn't help but to reflect on what the Christ exemplified for us on the cross. That's one of the, I believe, and increasingly believe that that was a symbol of a way towards that true integration, so to speak, not assimilation, but integration of differences governed by love, peace, and harmony. So with that, let's all approach the Lord's table in the grace that we have been extended today by this wonderful teaching. Thank you, God, as we come together. Thank you for the reminder once again, for the grace, that there is another way. There is another way towards peace and harmony, upholding one another's dignity in the midst of diverse worldviews, practices, culture. God, with this recognition and revelation, we come to the table to recognize Christ's broken body. Let's all partake. Broken for us. And then the shed blood of Christ, shed for all of us, for all humanity. Let's partake. Amen.
Hey, have a wonderful rest of today, everybody there and here. And by the way, my latest, I know some of you listen, but my latest podcast is an interview with Barb Harmett, who calls herself a recovered Zionist. So you might want to listen to that. We recorded it before October 7th, so that is not addressed, but it is addressed. All right. Happy Sunday, everybody.
Thank you all. Happy Sunday.